Hey, good morning, everyone, and hope you guys are all doing well this morning. Good to see you on a Monday morning. So it's fun doing this at home because everybody has to run when I start talking to my computer. So I got a Saul story. That's what this was. It's my Saul story this morning. I always got to be careful. Good morning, Kathy. I always got to be careful because when I start telling stories about churches where I was a pastor, I never know who's watching. Stella watches from my 10 years down in, good morning, Marianne, 10 years down in East Greenville. I got to know and love Stella's family. And I know some people watch from Cybert Church, where I was for 6 years. Hi, Marilyn. However, my first church where I spent 6 years, 2 years as assistant pastor, 4 years as pastor while I was going to college and seminary, Adamstown, Pennsylvania, although I still have some people that I keep in touch with from Adamstown. Pretty sure none of them watch, but I always have to be careful. I've been very, very fortunate, Don and I, in the churches we've pastored. For the most part, always very good experiences and people, great people, especially in those younger years when, man, I can't believe some of them put up with a young pastor who really didn't know a whole lot about what he was doing. Anyway, I got a story on Lighthearted Monday about that first church in Adamstown, Pennsylvania. And this is not a story I am proud of. I want you to know that right away. Good morning, Pat. Hi, Patrice. We were Adamstown. Have you ever driven through Adamstown before they had a 222 bypass from Reading into Lancaster? Adamstown was like the main drag. I don't even know if it was called Old 222, but Old 222, that was the main road from like Reading into Lancaster, went right through Adamstown. Adamstown was pretty much a one-street town. In fact, those of you who maybe have traveled back and forth to Lancaster, maybe you remember when they put the 222 bypass in, it ended right at Adamstown. And there was a time where you kind of had to go through Adamstown to hop on 222 on that bypass. And then for a lot of years, it ended right there before they completed it. But yeah, small town, about 1,000 people. And the church was on, exactly, one horse town, like East Greenville. Actually, Adamstown was smaller than East Greenville, Estella, because really it was just one main street. There was a couple really side streets. Good morning. Yes, Aaron Oktoberfest. Good morning, Aaron. Oktoberfest in Adamstown. Gosh, I forget his name, Stout. Was it Henry Stout, Harry Stout? But yes, Stout and Stout's Brewery and the Oktoberfest. Adamstown was kind of the antique capital of the world. They also made hats. They had hat factories there. And used to be, there are a lot of factories, silk mills and cigar factories in Adamstown, but they still had the Bowman Hat Factory. And one of the members of Adamstown Church, a guy named Dan Redkay, just a really good family. Dan Redkay was the head. His family had been the head of, I don't know if he was president or chairman of the board or owner, whatever, but it's been too long. I don't remember anymore, but he was in charge of the Bowman Hat Factory. And I got some tours, got to see how some hats, got a free hat, how some hats were made at Adamstown, and they had the Oktoberfest. And he actually, Mr. Stout, had a house right across the street from the church. Big house, big window, and they had a big window in the front. And the reason I bring that up is because they had this gorgeous grand piano right inside that window, that front window, so you could see it. Anyway, I'm chit-chatting here, and I got to get on with my day, so I don't want to start chit-chatting about all this stuff, but good memories about Adamstown. So the church was on the main drag through town, and it was a tiny landlocked church. Obviously houses on both sides. It was one of those churches built on a hillside because like a lot of towns in that part of Pennsylvania, these small towns, they're built in a valley on a hillside. So from the church and those houses just went up to a hill in the back of the church. But really, so there's no room. There was no room for expansion for that church or anything. Landlocked churches or houses on both sides. And if you, for some of you who know these small Pennsylvania towns like this, especially the ones that were built on a hillside, you had to the street entrance took you into the basement, and to get into the sanctuary, you had to go up a bunch of steps to get into the sanctuary. But small church, the whole church would have now. Our church, East Greenbelt, our church here, Horizon Church, our building, is not a huge building. In fact, even though we're in the midst of this COVID stuff, we just had a meeting yesterday, what we call the next step team after church, really just to figure out, we've really been processing what's the next smartest move for us building wise. But the Adamstown church was so small, the whole church would have fit into our just our sanctuary alone. It was a small church building. And that church really had been, like a lot of the small churches, really had been dying for quite a number of years. And when I started there, sorry. When I started there, it was actually a two-church charge. I started as the student assistant pastor at that church and another church, a significantly larger church in Reamstown, Pennsylvania. And I did the youth group at Reamstown. And then Adamstown had no youth. There was really nobody younger than, say, 60-ish. We started there, and in 1982 as a student assistant. I was a student assistant, and I think like 2 weeks after we started there, Donna and I got married. I still had to do my senior year of college and then 4 years of seminary. And 20 people, that was it. But good people. And there were some youth, but none of them attended. And I can't really say I blame them. But anyway, here's a story about the saw. Took me 7 minutes to get to this saw. I don't know how you put up with this stuff. Anyway, the church at some point had been renovated, and like a lot of churches, the church originally was built so that the seating, the pews were like lengthwise, so it was wider than it was deep, and the pulpit had kind of been on the side. And at some point they changed it so that the pews were it was, they switched it around so that the pulpit was up front and the pews were kind of lengthwise, if that makes any sense. But what happened when they did that is they had an altar railing up front. And when the church was wider than long, when it was oriented that way, they had the semicircular altar railing. And when they changed the whole thing around, for whatever reason, they kept that altar railing. If you can picture kind of the kneeling railing where you take communion, etc., they moved that down in the basement. And again, this is a small building, small basement. So that thing, that curved, that semicircular altar, it took up half the basement down there. Now, it wasn't a problem because there was no youth, there was no Sunday school. Really, the basement never got used. In fact, when we moved down there, when we moved there and went down there, it was just this dusty old basement that really there's no reason to keep it clean. An old building, I think it was built in 1894. I believe that's when it was. But after we were there, Donna and I, got this young whippersnapper pastor kind of thing. We talked about restarting a Sunday school and starting a youth group. And it's not that there was a ton of kids, but we figured they're never going to come if they don't have anything. So we started a Sunday school, and some of the kids started coming back, started a youth group. But one of the problems was using the basement. There was this semicircular altar railing that took up half the basement. And we wanted to do puppet shows, and we wanted to play games with the kids. And you really couldn't because you were always dealing with this altar railing down there that took up, half the basement. The tables were they had some tables that were set up around. There's no way you could have a dinner and put tables in the basement because, again, that altar railing took up the space. So just kind of casually one time, I talked to the leaders of the church and talked about, hey, can we get rid of this railing that's just sitting down in the basement? It wasn't attached. I mean, you could move it around, just sitting there. And of course, there was resistance to getting rid of the railing, the altar railing, because it's kind of a sacred symbol in some churches. It's where people came to know Christ, and it's where people took communion. So they were opposed to that. And this is what I'm not necessarily proud of. Not really knowing, young guy, not knowing how to really lead change in a church, and really not knowing best how to go about that. I really knew that this thing was in the way of using the basement. So late one night, in the middle of the night, I went into that church with a saw, not this one, and I cut up that altar railing. I cut it up in a whole bunch of pieces, took it in the back of my car, and got rid of it. And no one ever brought it up. I don't know if they didn't miss it. I mean, I have no idea. Again, they weren't using the basement for years. So I don't know if it's just that they didn't miss it, or if they were just too kind, but nobody brought it up. Nobody ever noticed that the altar railing was gone. So we just went on with life, and we started a youth group, and we started having dinners, and started the Sunday school, and everything went well. And I've often thought about the fact that, my goodness, I cut up this altar railing that people were opposed to getting rid of, and nobody ever started. It reminds me of another story. I know a pastor and an organist in a church, not mine, nothing to do with any church I was at, but it was a church where there was an organ and a piano, and the way they were oriented, the organist and the piano didn't face each other. I think they faced like the choir loft or something like that. And so they couldn't see each other, nor could they see the pastor. And at some point they brought up a need to change the orientation of the organ and the piano. And of course, everybody was opposed to it. So what the pastor and the organist did is every week they changed it about 2 inches. They just moved it slightly, 2 inches every week. Took about a year, and eventually the whole thing was changed around, and nobody noticed because the change was slow. And eventually someone was like, wait a minute, hey, didn't it used to face the other way? But anyway, so, that's kind of the way it is. And, we human beings, we struggle with change. And one of the reasons we struggle with change is just partly because, the way our brain works is as human beings, our body takes a lot of decisions and just makes them automatic, like typing. You don't have to, once you learn to type, you don't have to think, where is the H in driving? We both, Don and I, love driving stick shifts. So our cars are all stick. We don't even think about it after a while, because your body your body assigns certain things to do automatically. So obviously change disrupts that. You have to start thinking about things, and it's unsettling. And so, we don't like change, but sometimes that resistance to change gets in the way. Yeah. Sorry, Mom. Now you know the truth. The funny thing is about that, the cool thing about it, funny, whatever, I don't know. So as you can picture an altar railing. There's a fancy carved thing along the top, and then there's these pilasters in the middle, and then of course the bottom piece. And when I was cutting them up, those pilasters were, they were whole. Once you take the top off, there they are. And I started looking at these things, and I think, wow, they're pretty nice. So I kept a bunch of them, and I used them for candle holders. I don't have many anymore. I gave them all away, but used them for candle holders. And every once in a while, somebody would see, hey, that's pretty cool. And eventually they were all gone, but yeah, it served a purpose. Anyway, so we resist change. One of the interesting things about God is we talk about the fact that God is unchanging, and in some ways that can be a little bit unsettling, because we start to think, well, if he's unchanging, does that mean? I had a young kid ask me one time, in a youth group setting, we were talking about God being unchanging and Jesus and things. I don't remember what the subject was anymore, but he said, well, then if Jesus was here today, then he wouldn't understand computers, right? And And of course he was. When we talk about God being unchanging, that doesn't mean that God is stuck in a particular period of time. It doesn't mean that God is resistant to change, and it doesn't mean that God isn't knowledgeable about new things, or even about what tomorrow is going to bring. In fact, the fact that the God is unchanging means exactly the opposite. It means that God isn't fickle. It means that God isn't stuck. It means that God isn't unknowledgeable about certain periods of time, because God is kind of above time, and to be unchanging means that God is stable and God is knowledgeable about all periods of time, and God is never stuck in any particular time. So it's a really good truth about God. We struggle with change, we human beings, but God doesn't. God's never stuck in a particular period of time. God doesn't have to learn about change. He doesn't have to learn about computers. In fact, God even knows things about what's coming in our world, what we have yet to discover that we don't even know, because he is unchanging. It's a really good thing about God that God is unchanging, because it means exactly the opposite of what we think sometimes, that maybe God is stuck in the past, maybe God has archaic views and maybe he's outdated. And it means just the opposite, that because he is unchanging, God is not stuck and God is not archaic. So it's a cool thing about God, even though we struggle with change. God doesn't. He's above that. He isn't resistant to change. He isn't fickle. He's not kind of in heaven caught off guard about new things like we sometimes are. He's above all that. And it's a very sobering, very encouraging thing to know that even though we struggle with change, sometimes God doesn't. So anyway, that's my story, of which truthfully I am a little bit ashamed of. What I did 2 o'clock in the morning at the Adamstown Emmanuel EC Church, when I had decided on my own we needed to get rid of that altar railing. I wish I had managed that whole change thing better, but like I said, no one ever said a word. We went on with life, started a youth group, started a Sunday school, started having dinners down in that basement, setting up tables. And probably those people, if anybody noticed, they were just too compassionate and too good to make waves about what I'd done. On the other hand, I think a lot of people just never even noticed, never cared. Anyway, so it is a Monday, and it's supposed to be rainy this morning. It's actually gorgeous, so I think I'm going to grab my wife and take a walk, and then get on with my morning. So love you all, and let me pray for us on our Monday. God, thank you for your goodness. Thank you, God, that you are unchanging. And God, even though change unsettles us, especially, God, kind of right now, we don't even know where we are going. It's hard to make decisions. It's hard for us to say what next year is going to be like. It's hard for us to know when we get back to normal, what normal looks like. And God, I know sometimes, especially, I think of people who are struggling just to figure out, how do we make this all work? How do we do a business? How do we keep the economy functioning? God, I know that for us, not knowing and struggling with what is such an unsettling time, that is discouraging and disheartening to us, causes us a lot of stress. God, I pray that we'll find our stress relief in you, a God who is unchanging. You are not fickle. You are not thrown off course. You aren't resistant to change. And God, when we sing that you have the whole world in your hands, that is absolutely true. We say that, God, but I don't know if we believe it, but it is absolutely true. The world's in your hands. I pray, God, that we'd find our confidence. All of us who are struggling, anxious, tired, worried, worn out, not knowing what tomorrow brings, I pray, God, that we find our faith and our strength and our courage in you. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, everybody. Well, have a wonderful day, and I will see you tomorrow. Love you all. Goodbye.